Finger waves laid, never outdated. I laid them down. Award the lyrical crown queen on the scene. Always knew there was greatness in the Burton Green. Being for the microphone when I get it, it's on. Showing, prove, shown, and proven to be worth your while. When I contest with my dope styles, go on for miles of measures. I treasure my pleasure as well as you do when I hex you with this THC voodoo. I stand above. You lay beneath the layers of skin. I have depths of compassion, anger, and joy. This is no ploy. My mission is to kill and destroy. Toy with your emotions. Devotion to the hip hop I stand for. Giving you the raw core marrow. I know somebody's got my back because his eye is on the sparrow. Choke you up with this game. I will refrain. Slow down because the walls of your brain may not maintain.
I'm busting off like a tech, cause I got shots. The 90s was hot with Biggie and Pac. My memory has lost weight like Dick Gregory. When the spot is lit, nobody says jack shit. True indeed, my seasonal daddy puffs Sensi. Blunts packed like a 4-5 tie, a lie. Headpiece, twisted like a frisbee. Lips chapped, I'm rubbing on my naps. A lot of stress, but I stand the pain. I'm under the scope like an OJ murder stain. Eyes red like an infrared. I'm taking 2 to the head in the land of the calm dead. My sanity is like solitary. I'm lonely, so would some queen confront me? A shot of Hennessy keeps my peace twisted. From SCA to anywhere, bloodshot for the living. I remember them hallways and real late nights. Ill rock trying to get his spray tips right. Hitting my Adidas with the fresh shoe whites. Combined with 409, it was shine every time. I heard a lot of rhymes, brought the grind and the struggle. So many MCs only believe a couple. Running with the underworld, I stayed in trouble. Skipping class in them clothes, I stole through broken glass. Looking back to the past, I be like, who knew? Got my first strap from Too Quick, a pearl handle 22. Never in the backpack, always in the pocket. One up in the chamber, I ain't ever had to cock it. And this is not a brag, this is really what it was. Beefing with a hood crew, got mine club. Just a bunch of kids trying to claim they spot. Pocket full of stickers with the tag I rock, I ain't forgot.
Right about now.
In the 90s, the game claimed all brothers. And I ain't talking about the rainbow crosswalk, but you could get killed if you cross colors. I'm from an era where niggas would probably kill niggas and then turn around and buy some Tommy Hill figures. Clocking 4 mics up inside the source and just was walking door night to some biker shorts. It takes 2, baking soda and the white pal to make the cluck say, I want a box right now. We buying Nikes on sale and we rocking Timberlands and Nordica, but never been hiking or sailing. But why fool couldn't get a shine? And we shouldn't mind. I don't know, your guess is as good as mine. But now they bringing them sweaters from Coogee Mag and everybody's rocking with polo like they was Coogee Rap. So son, wake up to my composition. I do this cause I stay 1 leg up on the competition. What?
I ain't say I was on Union, I said I was on Lake Union. Yo, I was born into hip-hop, delivered by a witch dot, wearing Adidas flip-flops with an MCM wristwatch. Before I could ish talk, they told me that my ish hot. Around the time the Chronic came, that was when my wig popped. I was raised by O'Shea, Brad Jordan, Willie D, Dyra Boys, DMS, always kept me company. James Todd, Todd Shaw, put a mic in front of me. One of the flyest rhymers they told me that I was gonna be. Back in time, my mind goes to the 9-0s. I used to rock Mecha Tech and Red Rhino with my divine bros. In them divine clothes, 91 police caprice bumping the new Shine Pole. That was my ish then. Back in the days when 20 inches was a pretty big rim. Used to bump Snoop in the pig pen. And it's a trip when I look back at the fact that, man, we was just kids then. A trip when I look at the fact that, man, we was just kids then.
It's the Imperial, live on front of the box cereal. Little kids ripping it open for new material. Crack a jack prize for the lives for those nearest you. I'm working on my paper to bring the people a clearer view. Fuck that, we was bred to say some real shit. 95, turn of the classes who took your heels, bitch. BET, making a list to cross niggas off. Now they back, jacking the beats to make a killing boss. You don't just come in the room and rob your uncle, bro. So why the fuck you got on my shoes? I thought I told you no, but listen, I don't make all the rules. I got vertical, my bitches getting blurry. These questions you don't deserve to know. Africa, shaking no bones that make my phone work. UG, Eddie and A, it makes my soul hurt. Granny said back in the village is where your home is. Never to get lost in the SARS video showbiz.
Northwest hip hop. I was just wasting time. Had nothing on my mind but darkness. I couldn't give it to you like that. I would have started. Cerebral thinking got me wanna kill them all. And I don't know which way I'm gonna go. Swing the bat or throw the ball. Hit the bat or go the ball. Swing the bat for a nigga, take it off. I don't know what I'ma do, it's me against the law. I tell them freedom of speech, they break my jaw. I tell them I wanna go live, they tell me die. I'm asking them questions, they telling me why. Why is the question, why is the answer? They giving me steadily peddling banter about this and that, you know. Come on shit, I really know that all shit is coming to the future. I'll shoot you if I could, but I'd rather talk to you. God, I'd rather talk to you. Malcolm smacking me like, nigga, better do something. Martin telling me they wait for you to do something. And I'm just thinking, if it's a lose-lose, then I can't lose from nothing. If no weapon formed against me shall prosper, then I got to go at these niggas' neck like a roster and chopper. Excuse me, choppers have nothing to do with rosters. That's a rap term. I need to educate you all people. Or should I say, I should educate all people on better thinking, better speaking, because you are like foul play. You know, reaching for bars that you can't ever obtain. Your fatal really sick in the brain. To sport a life I came to a change. When dudes was rocking those throwbacks with a chain. Do-rag over nappy braids. Still eating on the sugar cane. Rest in peace unto me, you know. Black in Israel, I see it, though. Little sis cool, little Dave cool. I'm about to hit the yard soon.
Good evening. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm Stesha Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager at the Seattle Public Library. As we begin tonight, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. These are the traditional, unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past and present and thank them for their stewardship of this land. Welcome to tonight's program with Dr. Dowdy Abe and Jasmine Scott, presented in partnership with Langston, Wanawari, Elliott Bay Book Company, and University of Washington Press. We would also like to thank the Seattle Public Library Foundation, Seattle City of Literature, Author Series sponsor Gary Kunis, and the Seattle Times for generous support of library programs. I have a couple quick announcements before we get started. Copies of Emerald Street are available at Elliott Bay Book Company. They are open for limited browsing and curbside delivery, and of course, you can always order through their website, elliottbaybook.com. I also wanted to let you know that after the conversation portion of tonight's event, we'll have time for your questions. You can type your questions in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen at any time during the program. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Dr. Dowdy Abe is a Seattle-based professor, writer, and historian who's taught and written about culture, race, gender, education, communication, hip-hop, and sports for over 20 years. His earlier book is 6 in the Morning, West Coast Hip-Hop Music, 1987 to 1992, and the Transformation of Mainstream Culture. His work has appeared at blackpast.org and in The Stranger and the Seattle Times, and he's appeared on national media such as MSNBC and the Tavis Smiley Show. Dr. Abe holds an MA in Human Development and a PhD in Education from the University of Washington. He'll be speaking tonight with Jasmine Scott, the current and first program manager of Langston, Seattle's hub for Black arts and culture. Jasmine's also the co-founder of 50 Next, Seattle Hip Hop Worldwide, a digital time capsule highlighting Seattle and Northwest hip hop. And Jasmine was also the curator for a community exhibit on Seattle hip hop. The Legacy of Seattle Hip Hop exhibit had a highly successful eight-month run at the Museum of History and Industry and won the 2016 American Association for State and Local History Leadership in History Award. Recently, Jasmine curated and co-produced 206 The Break, a 7-episode series that took a uniquely local spin on the recently popularized DJ live streaming sessions. They'll be talking today about Emerald Street, a history of hip hop in Seattle, which chronicles the development of Seattle hip hop and explores how Seattle hip hop culture goes beyond art and music, influencing politics, the relationships between communities of color and law enforcement, the changing media scene, and youth outreach and educational programs. Please help me welcome Jasmine Scott and Dr. Dowdy Abe.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much, Stesha, for that wonderful introduction. We are so happy to be here, and we're actually very happy to be in person. It was really important for Dowdy and I to be able to chat together in person. We were supposed to do it at Langston Hughes, but unfortunately, due to some unforeseen circumstances, we had to relocate, so we're in a different location, but we are together, and we're so happy to be talking. The video that a lot of you guys saw as you were coming into the Zoom is on YouTube. It was shot by Alive and Black, and it was actually shot in 2016 at the MOHI, the Legacy of Seattle Hip Hop exhibit that I co-curated. And so that's kind of where we're gonna start this conversation. The Legacy of Seattle Hip Hop was an exhibit that Aaron Walker Loud and I co-curated at MOHI, and it ran, like Stesha said, from September 2015 until May of 2016. And it included hundreds of items and artifacts that were primarily loaned or donated by artists and influencers from across the Pacific Northwest. And the exhibit is initially how Dowdy and I became connected. I reached out to you in the summer of 2015 to invite you to be a part of the exhibit. And the primary reason that I wanted to invite you to be a part of it is because I was aware of the Seattle hip hop timeline that you created and that you had been working on. And I felt like it was just going to be a really vital addition to the story that we were attempting to tell through the exhibit. And so the timeline really ended up providing a pretty thorough through line for the exhibit, and nearly 50 items that we were able to procure from donors and lenders matched up to different points within the timeline itself. And it really, like I said, helped to tell the story that we were trying to tell. So before we kind of talk a little bit more about the exhibit itself, can you tell us a little bit more about what prompted you to put the timeline together in the first place, and how long of a process that was for you?
Well, first of all, it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening. Thank you for the invitation. That started off, the timeline actually kind of started off kind of being the skeleton of the book in a lot of ways. And so that was really just finding as many items of consequence as I could. And that's not to say that you know what I mean, that it's so comprehensive that it captures every single thing, because it certainly doesn't. But no, just trying to find as much information as I could and kind of have that be the scaffolding, if you want to call it that, of what eventually comes up being the book. And I'm just, you know, I have to say that I'm overwhelmed by the support and love that has come out of this whole entire project. And I'm not just talking about the eventual release of the book, but I'm talking about people in the community, like when we went on before, people in the community like your mother, who reached out to me via email to give me a heads up about how Rapper's Delight actually got its start here in Seattle. And I know we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I'm just using that just as an example of how I tried to cast as wide a net as possible to get factually correct information to kind of be the spine of the book. And so that and the motivation was and is that these two things, this book is kind of the intersection of two things that I love dearly and have contributed in a lot of ways to kind of helping make me the person I am, and that's the city of Seattle and hip hop. And so I was excited, you know what I mean, to try and undertake this, and so I feel lucky. Like I said, I'm super humbled by all of the support. it is less about me in this book, for me anyway, and more about an overall celebration of the culture in this city.
For sure. And how long of a process, like when did it start? When did that process of like creating the timeline, which eventually went into this book that we have today, like when did that process start?
So I do have to give a shout out to Charles Mudede, and and the reason that I have to do that is because it's a little inside joke here. I love you, Charles, though. I have to say that. But no, he was, so in 2006, he was putting together like a little package about local hip hop for the stranger. And he asked me to do a brief like 1,000-word history, which I was like, okay, but 1,000 words, what are you really gonna do?
Can't get
So
anywhere.
as I started getting into kind of researching that initial article, I was like, well, there's probably a book here. And so it was, I think maybe I did some initial early interviews with James Croon and Eddie Wells, and just kind of setting the stage. And I think a lot of it was also my own curiosity, talking to these actual people that I had heard so much about over the years. And so, but at that time I was in the midst of trying to get 6 in the morning out of my hands, and get published out there in the world. And that took some time. And so I don't think that wasn't until 2013. And so there was a pretty quick turnaround once that was finished and ready to go, and when I was able to turn and give my full attention to this. So we're talking about, technically, we're talking about it starting in 2006, and I would kind of revisit little bits and pieces here and there, but the real actual, really getting the hands dirty in terms of research. And shout out to the Seattle Public Library, by the way. I spent a lot of time down there going through old editions of the Rocket. So I really appreciate that. But so yeah, that's when, about 2013 is when the real heavy lifting in terms of researching and not even the writing. Just there was probably a good couple years of just researching and getting in touch with people and making interviews. And I mean, you know how hip hop is, it's tough to get hold of just regular people. Trying to get hold of hip hop people and nail them down for a time, you know how that is.
It'll
man.
be months before you get a response.
Right. So but I was persistent. I was trying to find that line for a lot of people, and trying to track down a lot of people, that line between being persistent and being a bugaboo. And I probably crossed into bugaboo territory a few times, but I was serious about trying to get this. Yeah, I was serious about trying to get this done. So it's about 2013 is when the real full steam ahead action for the book started.
Okay. So in chapter 5 of this book, you have a section about cultural institutions embracing local hip hop, and that's where you first mentioned the MoHi and the Legacy of Seattle Hip Hop exhibit. And then you went on to highlight other things like Hip Hop History Month being recognized in the state of Washington, and Northwest Folk Life Festival making hip hop its cultural focus during the 2015 festival. So why are these events so important, and why do you think it took so long for cultural institutions to recognize local hip hop as an important element of, the Seattle story?
I think that's an interesting point. I think 2015 was the catalyst for 2 of those events, as you mentioned, the MoHi exhibit and then Folk Life. And so Folk Life has been going on for 40 some years, for quite a while. And for the last 25 or so, they have done the cultural focus, which is like the festival within the festival. Right. And for the first time in 2015, hip hop was the cultural focus of the festival. And then, as you said, MoHi. And then I want to say it was 2010 that King Chasm and 206 Zulu went on this real kind of like crusade in some ways of getting Hip Hop History Month recognized in November, first in Seattle. Yep. Then there were the cities of Olympia, I want to say Tacoma, and maybe Bremerton. The mayors of those cities jumped on board, and then Jay Inslee, the governor, jumped on board to make it through the whole month. But I don't want to make it oversimplified, but I think that the mega success of a white Seattle rap artist helped set the stage, I think, for a lot of these kind of mainstream venerable institutions to kind of turn and want to say, oh, well, let's
Make it
embrace it,
plain.
and let's, you know, and let's you know, look at all the good work they've been doing, and so I don't want to say that that's the only reason, but I do think that that was a heavily influencing factor, if in my opinion, you know what I'm saying? I don't know that for sure, but I'm just saying, just because for such a long time, it was, you know, it was that. So overall hip hop history, there was a time, so I teach this hip hop class at Seattle Central, and, you know, most of the kids who take the class, late teens, early 20s, and it's through no fault of their own. It was just when they were born. They have no memory of hip hop being anything but the most mainstream of the mainstream.
Right.
And so it's a little bit hard for them sometimes to really grasp or wrap their heads around a time when the mainstream kind of wanted nothing to do with hip hop, if we're talking about kind of the first half well into the 1980s. And so I feel like there was a little bit of a parallel of that kind of in the microcosm of Seattle, in terms of these mainstream institutions for a long time. You know, in the late 80s and early 90s was the first time that rappers from here, local rappers, even got a chance to perform,
Right.
you know, much less, you know, be featured, but just perform on one of the side stages at Folklife. And so it was a long and gradual process. And so I think the maturation of the scene itself was also a big part of it, but I don't think that you can discount the success of Macklemore and how much that made mainstream Seattle and its related institutions pay attention.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I definitely, you know, was recognizing that when we were in our process. And, you know, while I appreciate, you know, I forever appreciate Mohai for doing what they did, you know, taking that step and trusting us to come into their institution and do what we did. You know, to some extent, I also don't feel like institutions necessarily deserve a huge pat on the back because it took that long. Hip hop's been around for 40 years, and it took until 2015 really, and it took until someone who looked like them for it to be recognized and appreciated.
If I may turn the tables just a tiny bit on you, I mean, did you ever get a sense of why they were doing what they were doing at that particular time? Did you ever have a conversation with any Mohai person that was you know, in that decision-making process as to why then, or?
I'm sure there were a number of conversations, but one of the reasons that we actually got introduced to Mohai, and, you know, you mentioned this in the book too, that, you know, we started this 50 Next in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the World's Fair in Seattle, which was where the Space Needle, you know, that kind of was born from that event. And Steve Sneed, who we'll talk about more later, but who is very important to me, very important to this city, was working with the Seattle Center with the cultural programs. And so he was kind of leading some of the programming for the Next 50. And he approached Aaron actually to come up with some ideas around how do we celebrate hip hop within the celebration. And ultimately we all put our heads together to do something more than just an event that people can come to, leave, and forget about. We wanted to do something that really kind of cemented hip hop within this commemoration. So we put together this website that we call a time capsule of Seattle hip hop. Of course, it's not the full, just like anything else, it's not the full story, but we collected, you know, nearly 80 tracks from local hip hop artists and featured that. We put together a short film that featured a lot of the early folks in Seattle hip hop to really tell the early story. And Steve then introduced us to the Black Heritage Society, which has a relationship with Mohai. So we initially connected with Mohai to do a one-day event in February 2014, I believe it was, celebrating hip hop. And we called that the Legacy of Seattle Hip Hop. It was a one-day event. It was a gigantic event where they saw nearly 1,000, you know, attendees throughout that day. And then they were like, oh my God, we want to continue to work with you guys. So, you know, I think a lot of that was just based on them seeing what we brought to the table, what we could bring to their museum, because within that event, we brought tons of people, but we also, you know, it was performances, it was activities, it was panel discussion. And so we really brought some depth into what local hip hop is that they hadn't seen. And we introduced that to that institution. And so I do think that that was a big part of it. But of course, in that process, you know, when Macklemore donated his coat and the little scooter thing, it was like, oh my God, oh my God. And there was a lot of hoorah over that versus some of the other things that other artists contributed. And so, you know, when the media was talking to museum staff, for instance, that was the go-to of the conversation versus when they would talk to me and I would talk about, you know, DJ Supreme's jacket and top spins, you know, mixer and things like that. So, you know, it is what it is.
Right.
But anyway, you know,
the exhibit was outstanding. You know what I mean? It was, and I'm not just saying that because I was involved with it. And it was, I got a lot of feedback from a lot of people who were just going through it and were like, wow, I had no idea of the depth.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So salute to you and to Aaron. That was a fantastic exhibit.
Thank you. Well, that actually goes to my next point because, you know, throughout the run, we got a lot of praise, but we also got some criticism. And this is actually related to the inside joke that you brought up a few minutes ago. Because in an article that Charles Mudede wrote in The Stranger, his, I guess, review of the exhibit, one of the things he said is, quote, "The show suffers from being a blooming confusion of images, bits of facts, snippets of interviews, flyers, old school boom boxes, samplers, mixing equipment, and so much else." End quote. And then many people, you know, reached out to us to tell us, you know, what they felt was missing, who was missing, or to ask us why certain artists or elements were highlighted over others. And, you know, so I bring this up because I know that you've received similar criticisms, you know, for example, regarding the timeline, you know, you may receive some regarding this book. And I think that, you know, the both of us, we've openly acknowledged that we're not telling a complete story. That's not what we're doing. We know that it's not possible for any one of us to tell the entire story of the history of Seattle hip hop. You know, we're just doing what we can. But so there's a lot of work that has been done and that's being done to continue to tell the stories of Seattle hip hop. So do you hope that this book will inspire people to continue to further document the scene and also to elevate it in spaces that we were once shut out of?
Yes, most definitely. And to your point, there is a little bit of piece in the acknowledgements, a sentence in the acknowledgements section that I'd like to highlight, because I knew based on your experience, I knew I should probably put this in here. So in the acknowledgements, there's a sentence here, I'm reading here: "Props and respect to the journalists and writers, whether cited here or not, who put in work covering the scene, and a special shout out to anyone not mentioned enough or at all. Still an important part of this great history." And I put that in there. So this is layered here. This is a layered answer. So I put that in there, and I purposely titled this book "A History of Hip Hop in Seattle" and not "The History of Hip Hop in Seattle." Because, you know, my wife might tell you I'm a little bit arrogant, but even I am not so arrogant to where I'm going to think that I can cover 40 years of history, 40 plus years of rich history in a couple hundred pages. So I'm not foolish enough to think that. But I also wanted to, because I'm 50 years old, and as I look back, I consider myself kind of first generation hip hop kid. When I was 9 years old, you know what I mean? My pops took me to Dirt Cheap Records right there. It used to be on 22nd and Union, and that's where I got Rapper's Delight. I literally stumbled on it, and it changed my life like it did for so many other people. But just understanding that the fullness of the history is not going to be captured in one book. And when you think about how to organize the history and you know, who makes it into the book and who doesn't make it into the book, you know, I could not say that I have no biases bringing in. No researcher is bias free in terms of what they do. So I certainly will not try to say that none of my biases kind of played into you know, who may have been that kind of thing. But as I look at my age and I look at, you know, hip hop's always been such a kind of a youth focused culture, and it is, but now there's kind of this older element, you know, to it, like people like myself and peers my age. And it's not time for me. It's like pass the mic, you know what I'm saying? It might be kind of getting that time. You know, I'm not ready to retire right now, obviously, but I mean, I guess I have to be realistic and see that, you know, I can see that somewhere not too far down the road, as fast as these first 50 years have gone. And so part of it is to just try and use this as possibly some type of, and this is really even, I'm not even right to say that. I was going to say use this as kind of a jump off point, but this was actually a jump off point for so much other research and work that has been done by people like Giorgio Brown and Larry Mizell and people who have been on top of the scene kind of documenting it. So this is, I would correct myself and say that this is more of a piece of that canon around local hip hop and the various ways that it was and has been documented, and really kind of hoping to set the stage for the next generation of teachers and scholars and researchers who are coming up. I mean, the extent of this book is up to 2015, and so much has happened already in that time since then. And so I think that there is so much room to cover. Look, in my opinion, you could write an entire book on breaking in Seattle. That one element of the culture in itself there's enough that has happened here that could fill up an entire book. So there are a whole bunch of pieces and kind of specific, you know, if in the 90s and 2000s, kind of overall books about hip hop history were kind of the thing. I know Vibe had a book about hip hop history, and then the kind of one that's looked at as kind of the definitive one is Can't Stop, Won't Stop by Jeff Chang. But then as you get into the 2000s, further into the 2000s and the early 2010s, you start to have what Emerald Street is part of, is the kind of the next phase of hip hop scholarship, and that is the examination of specific times and places. That's what 6 in the Morning was. 6 in the Morning was a look at West Coast hip hop, basically California, Los Angeles, and Bay Area between the years of 87 and 92, right smack dab in the middle of the golden era of rap. And so it's kind of the same thing here. And I think that setting up this point to be taken from, setting it up, you know what I'm saying, the baton, it's like the handing of the baton, I think is useful. And I definitely want to be an encourager, someone who doesn't just want to bask in the glow of this book, but wants really people to kind of push ahead. And so if I'm saying that, so there's a book called Bounce. It's about New Orleans music. There's a book called Third Coast that's examining Dirty South and Outkast and Timberland. There's a book about hip hop in Houston. And there's 6 in the Morning in Emerald Street. And so there could be even a next phase of scholarship where it goes even more specific, not just examining the hip hop scene in specific towns, but specific elements of the hip hop scene in those specific towns. Yeah. I think that there's still way more room to get even more a fine point on the research kind of questions and answers that people are finding as it relates to so many of the different elements of hip hop.
Yeah, I think your work can really be like textbook for folks that want to expand on those things, you know. And I think about the work that Third Andreessen is doing. You know, not long after we completed the exhibit, we spoke with him, and you know, just talking about putting together an archive, and it was really like, yeah, you know, we don't intend to do this work forever, you know, and we never went into this intending to be, speaking for myself, like a historian or like the keeper or the gatekeeper of, you know, telling the Seattle hip hop story. And so it's really about, hey, you know, we did this piece. Take what you need from it, and run with it.
Yep.
And so, yeah, we're on the same page with
Mhm.
that. So before to kind of lead into the next little bit that I want to talk about, there's a piece that you wanted to pull from the book and read from. So why don't you give us a taste?
I warned you before we started.
I'm not even gonna look at you.
Don't laugh out there.
I can't look.
Okay, it's good lighting here. Good. Okay. On January 20th, 1966, Reverend John H. Adams of First AME Church told the advisory committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission hearing, quote, "Seattle is one of the few cities left in America which can solve its racial problem before it becomes unsolvable," end quote. In this statement, Adams spoke for numerous Black, Latino, Native, Asian, and white residents who, quote, "still summon the courage to believe in a peaceful racial future for the city and the nation," end quote, wrote Dr. Quintard Taylor in The Forging of a Black Community. But that optimism has yet to be fully justified. Over ensuing decades, racial tensions have been further inflamed by such issues as police misconduct, educational inequities, and increasing gentrification. Taylor concluded, quote, "Indeed, Seattle's apparent success and its underlying failure in its race relations paradigm has been its meticulously crafted image, which promoted the illusion of inclusion." And I think that the terminology attached to that, the illusion of inclusion, is really brilliantly put, and it's really so apt because there's a kind of a dichotomy around race in Seattle, at least in my opinion. This place has a progressive racial reputation, and on some levels that is deserved. That is, there were things happening around here that weren't happening necessarily in other places. Black men and Black women for a time were voting in the Washington Territory in the 1880s. And I mean, the 1880s, Black people voting in the 1880s, especially if you compare that to Oregon, right. And you know what I'm saying, what was happening in Oregon and how they were, you know, and what their attitude was toward Black people, and obviously other parts of the country. And so you have that, but you also have kind of a little kind of a self-congratulatory kind of pat on the back kind of thing, and then people who will say, well, at least we're not Mississippi, or, you know, we're not Alabama. And my response is like, come on, yo, that's a low bar. You know what I'm saying? And so even if you have this racially progressive tradition, that certainly does not insulate you or immunize you from having these structural issues around racism, as we've seen with both Seattle Public Schools and the Seattle Police Department coming under federal investigation specifically for their treatment of Black people.
Yeah. He came out guns blazing, y'all. Okay, I mean, I don't know. Well, I think that some of what you said will probably relate a little bit to this next question anyway, because when I was reading the book, a lot of what stood out to me is the significance of place, and how we, especially as Black people, identify with place. You know, our place in this, finding our place in this city. And in the first few pages of the book, you have a map of the greater Seattle area, and it points out the neighborhoods and locations that you have mentioned throughout the book. And, you know, so first about the neighborhoods that you speak of, the neighborhood that gave birth, so to speak, to the foundation of hip hop locally, you know, is the Central District, which is our historically Black neighborhood. And then, of course, it kind of moves south into the south end of Seattle. So, you know, again, like, why is it important to recognize those neighborhoods, but especially the CD, when we're telling the story of hip hop in Seattle?
You know, as massive kind of billion-dollar business as it is now, it had very humble beginnings. And, you know, really, in fact, hip hop is not even really supposed to be here.
Right.
I mean, if you were thinking about and talking about where it came from and who it came from, it's not supposed to be here. if people ask me what's a good movie to watch to get a sense of early hip hop, and I say Wild Style, and it's not. I say that I don't say that because of the production value or because of the terrific writing or anything.
Right.
I mean, a lot of ways it feels like a scripted documentary. But one thing that has always struck me about that movie are this kind of the location shots that they have of just the blocks and blocks and blocks of rubble-strewn fields, of abandoned buildings, of just it's just unbelievable that it has risen from where it came from. Like I said, it's not supposed to be here. So, you know, young people like myself in the early 80s were kind of protective of it. Well, because of that, but also there was a little bit of apprehension, at least on my part, speaking for myself, because, you know, disco had been maybe the music of the 1970s. And then the 80s come and it's out of here. Almost felt like almost overnight disco was out of here. And so it seems silly to think that now, but back then it was like, that was a real source of apprehension for me about, well, what if that happens to hip hop?
Yeah.
What we didn't know, you know, there was no blueprint, there was no map for how it was going to go. And so the unlikely rise of the culture combined with the fact that it was so rooted in the community. I mean, we're talking about stuff like, you know, the more famous ones are Sir Mix-a-Lot's parties. Well, he started off first at the Rainier Vista Boys and Girls Club throwing those parties, and then switched locations to the Boys and Girls Club right there off 19th and Yesler. And so those were just regular parties that kids would go to every weekend. And it happened to be Sir Mix-a-Lot who would grow up to be this, you know what I mean, this really kind of helping put local hip hop on the map. But, you know, you had those types of things kind of dotted around the area. I remember going to those kind of the equivalent of those parties in the basement of the Madrona Presbyterian Church. And Selecta Rock Caldwell would be DJing those dances. And so all kind of around in different spots, you had places within community that were kind of that were cheap, relatively safe, family friendly, that people could just go and experience hip hop. Just, you know, in some ways it was like, you know, not that it was matching up to necessarily like the Latin Quarter or these, you know, famous places from New York, but those were places where community was built. And those were places where young kids felt like we could go and be amongst people who felt this similar and kind of common connection to this new and exciting youth culture. And so I think that the grounded nature and kind of communal nature of how it started off and how it felt like it really, in the beginning, it really felt like it was ours. It was all of ours. It wasn't, I mean, obviously you had famous people like Run DMC and Treacherous 3 and people like that kind of early on, but it was so kind of new and organic. You really, at least, again, I can only speak for myself, but I really felt an ownership stake in it almost, because it was so new. And one thing we did know is we were there for the beginning. We were there to see it at its very start. And so I guess in some ways, you know, I looked at it as like a child or a younger sibling or something that I wanted to do well. I wanted desperately to see do well, but also had a lot of anxiety around people talking trash about it, or, you know what I'm saying, you know, critics and, you know, all of the stuff that came after it. And so I just think that that getting back to the point of your question was just the community laced nature of it, and how heavily invested people, you know what I'm saying? I've never rhymed in front of anybody in my life, but I'm still just so invested in the culture. So it wasn't necessarily that you had to be a performer. Of course I did little bop offs with, you know what I'm saying? But I never really went after it as like a something that serious. I was just, you know what I'm saying, part of the community. And I think that sense of ownership and fellowship is something that really, really drove not only the scene here, but I think that was probably the case in a lot of local startup areas as they started kind of forming their identity around what local hip hop would look and sound like.
So my next question is it kind of really is picking up where you would, in the direction you were going, because many locations around the city also played a really important role in the growth of the hip hop scene over the years. And like you said, Sir Mix-a-Lot, he gained his initial notoriety doing DJ parties at the Boys and Girls Clubs. Massive Monkeys formed out of Jefferson Community Center. Steve Sneed, who I mentioned before, he made Langston Hughes accessible to neighborhood youth to develop their interest in the arts. And he and Rico Bembry connected hip hop with theater. Latif's was one of the first locations that embraced local hip hop and hosted open mics. Jonathan Moore created Sure Shot Sundays at the Sit and Spin. And then we have places like the Mecca and Hidmo that became cultural hubs and centers for underground hip hop. So, you know, that access that was really allowed at places like these and others, it really contributed to the shifting dynamic of how local hip hop was made available to folks. And the people like Lester Green, Jonathan Moore, Rahwa Habti, Steve Sneed, you know, those were some of the driving forces behind the elevation of local hip hop over the past 4 decades. Really important people, among others. And so I'm particularly interested in hearing more about the stories and the people behind Latif's, the Sit and Spin, or Sure Shot Sundays, I should say, Hidmo, and then of course Langston Hughes. So can you talk a little bit more about those locations in particular and the impact that they've had on the local scene?
So I think, so if the Boys and Girls Club was kind of the spiritual home for kind of that first generation of hip hop, I would say that I would argue that Langston Hughes was that for the next generation, and Jonathan Moore, as you bring him up, I mean, so that guy was a complete Seattle original. I mean, he was a true hip hop renaissance man. I mean, so when I was doing my interviews, so one of the things I tried to do was after I would interview somebody, at the end, I would ask them for the names of like 2 or 3 people that they think I should talk to. So I got finished with the first interview with Jonathan, and it was like, some of the interviews would run longer than others. But this guy, I mean, the first interview lasted about a couple of hours, and I left that interview with just my head spinning like, damn, I mean, what hasn't this guy done? And so I get home, I'm reviewing the interview, I'm kind of taking notes, I'm doing all this, and I'm like, he still has more to talk about. So I have to go back and do a whole other, because I mean, he's been a label founder and owner, he was an artist, he was a tour manager. I mean, it's just, and even just outside of just the business of doing hip hop, I mean, the guy was, I know you didn't ask this, but I mean, I'm just thinking,
we can talk about Jonathan.
Because I'm struck just by all of the, I mean, so like in 2000, as I say in the book, I think I'm supposed to say that at some point, but like in 2000, the early 2000s, there was a shooting at a club, and the mayor openly was like, hip hop caused, you know, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but he was saying out in public at a press conference that hip hop was the cause of the shooting. And like within days, a protest had been organized, a peaceful protest had been organized by Jay Moore, among others, to just, you know what I'm saying, let people know. I mean, it is not like hip hop to allow something like that to go unresponded to. And he just operating within that hip hop frame of mind just brought people together to just be like, I'm saying, we don't have to come out here and talk about, you know, us, you know, our humanity, you know what I'm saying, and being decent. You know what I'm saying? Right. We're already those things. Right. We don't have to come out here and prove that to you. We're just coming out here because we disagree with this public stance that was made. And so, you know, among other things, he's going to Langston Hughes, and he is, you know, kind of, so like, you know, the whole idea of late night basketball and, you know, like Friday and Saturday nights having gyms open so young people, teens can come in and be off the street and, you know, hoop if they want to. You know, he was doing that same kind of thing with arts. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, the equivalent of that with musical equipment.
And this was due, side note for those of you guys who don't know, due to the teen dance ordinance that lasted
yes.
a ridiculously long time.
85, I think, to 92. And so
I thought it was 2002.
Oh yeah, sorry, 2002.
Yeah.
You're right.
85 to 2002.
Basically choked the life out of the all age scene here. And, you know, any hip hop environment needs young people and all age shows and activities for them to go to and to kind of interact. And that really kind of just choked the life out of it for a good. But even still in the face of that, you know what I'm saying, local hip hop people and
Right,
were
so
able to.
he was doing this
to
in
make it happen
response.
anyway.
Yeah.
And I have to say, you know, I don't know every local scene, but I can't imagine that there are too many others that have as much kind of community focus as is found here. I mean, you just off the top of the head, you have like 206 Zulu. You have people like Y King, who brought the Seattle chapter of the Hip Hop Youth Action Summit
Right.
here. You have and so you have people and you have places, and you have a place like you mentioned, Jefferson Community Center, which to me is the site of one of my favorite stories in the book, and so in a lot of ways that ended up kind of being the mecca of breaking in Seattle, and so you have someone like Fever One, and Fever. Fever and I went to middle school. So we went to middle school when Summit was housed in the Coleman building. So we were there. We were in 8th grade, and the year after it shut down, and then Omari and them went in there and took it over. And so I was watching Fever do his thing. You know what I'm saying? We were friends from I was seeing it from an early age. So he graduates from Ingram, moves to New York, and man, probably toward the mid-ish 90s, like what is it, 97? It's on the timeline, 97, 98, somewhere in there. He's invited to join Rocksteady Crew. And I mean, hold up. People may or may not know about Rocksteady, but think about, it is the equivalent of like Alvin Ailey Dance Company, or the Joffrey Ballet, or whatever kind of thing you want to put out there. It's like, there is no greater crew. If you're a breaker, there's no greater crew you can join than Rocksteady. And it would have been easy for Fever to be like, Rocksteady, wear my Rocksteady jacket around. But no, he came directly back here and starts he's leveraging that and starts working with kids at Jefferson. And one of these kids is a young kid named Jerome from Burien. And I remember Fever telling me as he's recounting this story that it wasn't that Jerome was the best dancer at the time, but there was just kind of something in him that kind of drew them together and kind of had Fever take him under his wing. And this kid, Jerome, eventually goes on to co-found Massive Monkeys.
Right.
They go on to win not one, but 2 world championships. One in 2004 at Wembley Stadium at the World B-Boy Masters. And then in 2012, they go to the R16 in Seoul, South Korea and win that. And that contest that contest was so cold. Not only had No American Crew won that title, No American Crew had even made it to the finals of that one. And so it's so fantastic how you have generations of B-boys and B-girls kind of, and then now Massive has done the exact same thing and leveraged that into their own studio to Beacon.
Right.
And you have people like Anna Banana Freeze offering specific classes, like one of them was titled Way of the B-Girl, creating a specific space for women and girls to learn dance. And so I just think that the community focus, the community stories around, and there's so many of them. I mean, like literally almost from the beginning are just unbelievable. And you just kind of were talking about Jay Moore. I mean, that whole Sure Shot Sunday thing was a way to get around that teen dance ordinance.
Yep.
Because it was like, what was it, like a 10 o'clock? It was like
Sunday
10 o'clock
afternoon.
or 9 or 10 o'clock was the limit when you had to,
Right.
whatever you were doing, you had to shut it down. So he's holding it in the afternoon. And man, to have a space where there has to be a space where young people can come and see and listen and participate in live hip hop, in my opinion, for it to be part of a healthy scene. And that was someone, Jay Moore was someone in that instance who intentionally put that programming on as a way to counteract the teen dance ordinance and all the damage that it was doing to the local scene.
Absolutely. My goodness.
That goes fast, right?
Lord have mercy. We were saying off camera that we needed, at least 3 hours to have this conversation. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, so we can try to cover a few more topics within the amount of time we have, and then see if there's questions later on from the viewers. But another story that I'm closely connected to is how you mentioned hip hop actually arrived in Seattle. Robert L. Scott, who was the first Black on-air radio personality locally, He happens to be my father, and he was the one who played Rapper's Delight for the first time on Seattle radio in 1979. And that was on AM 1250 KYAC. And they that eventually gave way for the legendary DJ Nasty Ness to host his once a week show, Fresh Tracks, on KFOX, which was formerly KYAC, which was the first rap radio show west of the Mississippi. And then Fresh Tracks eventually evolved into Night Beat, which was a nightly rap show that ended up being the highest rated radio show, even above those on FM radio. So can you just talk a little bit about why, my dad playing Rapper's Delight was considered a bold move at that time, and then how groundbreaking it was for Ness to host all rap radio shows in the 80s?
So it was a bold move. It's not like program directors were falling all over each other to play that record.
Right.
But the visionary sample that Sylvia Robinson pulled into that song, using the bass line from the song Good Times by the group Chic, made it very accessible. I think most people, I know the first time I heard it, I recognized the bass line. I was like, oh, okay, this sounds familiar. I think I've heard this before. And then the vocals come on and everything was just like, what is this? I'm sorry, what was the question?
Being a bold move, right. But then also Ness groundbreaking.
So that first playing of the record started to get people like, wow. And so it quickly becomes the most requested record on not only on KYAC, but also on KFOX. So it's fall of 1979 that KYAC plays Rapper's Delight for the first time on radio. But I think in 1980, not too long after that, the ownership change happens at KYAC, and the call letters are changed to KKFX. And I think some people do find it funny, especially in the class when I'm telling them about this. They're like, you listen to hip hop on AM radio? I was like, man, hey, you took it where you could get it at that time. Of course, it would have sounded much better on FM, but I mean, damn, I was just happy it was being played at all.
Yeah.
But so Ness coming on, and Ness talked about how he had visited his sister in New York City and was hearing, Jelly Bean Benitez and the Latin Rascals on WTKU, I think it is. And so he's like asking his sister, can you tape these shows and send them to me? Yeah. So in a lot of ways, he was kind of giving what Seattle had never had, which was live mixing and scratching on the air. I mean, that was unheard of around Seattle. I mean, people were losing their minds. It was like the accessibility that young people have to their music is really something that it can be easy to take for granted. And I'm just thinking about the scarcity of how long you had to wait, or at least how long I had to wait for new stuff to come. And also, I think it's interesting to kind of highlight places like Music Menu, Dirt Cheap Records, Beverly's Records and Tapes. A little bit later, another record store would come along. And I think it's important to highlight those places because they weren't only places where you would go to buy music. In a lot of ways, there were social gathering spots where you would go there not only to buy music, but to hear music. You would go in there and there would always be kind of promotional copies, behind the desk. And you ask the person at work, and anything new? Yeah. Anything, what you got? I can remember 87 going with John Ward, my dear departed friend, John Ward, to Beverly's. And this has been 87, and coming out of there with Rebel Without a Pause by Public Enemy, and hearing that tea kettle blast for the first time, oh man, lost my mind. But I'm just saying that the community-ness that was fostered by hip hop and just on Monday morning, I mean, the talk of every middle and high school every Monday morning during that time was what happened on Fresh Tracks the night before. Oh, did you hear this? Oh, did you hear that? People trying to front like they had the new cuts, but then sometimes he would intersperse, Fresh Tracks on KFOX. And you would try to pause it so people wouldn't know that you taped your music off of Fresh Tracks. So there was all kinds of wild stuff going on. But having that here and having Ness introduced and also be kind of eclectic, I think he was a little bit like Africa Bambaataa in the sense of pulling a lot of different styles of music from a lot of different genres. He would have stuff in there by like Kraftwerk. You know what I'm saying? The song Tour de France, which is Kraftwerk, is a German band, a white band, very synth oriented. Or he would have stuff like from Hall & Oates. I mean, I love Hall & Oates to this day,
for sure,
because of how Ness would mix them in to his master mixes. And so I think that the not only that, okay, so not only that, but I would also say that Ness's willingness to put his own whatever ego he may have had aside, you know, is something that leads to this seminal kind of meeting between him and Mix-a-Lot. As he starts to hear about these parties that are happening at the Boys and Girls Club, he goes to investigate. He's like, man, I got to go see this. And he's immediately impressed by the way that Mix-a-Lot is commanding the crowd, because at that time he's doing everything. He's scratching, he's mixing, he's rhyming at the same time. And so he sees him, they meet, invites him on air, and you know, that snowball really starts rolling from there. So I just think that in so many ways, so many different people, starting with your father playing that record, really that the first time that he plays that record on the radio here, I think you can equate it to lighting a fuse, and that starts to get people listening to it. They start to go buy it at the record stores, and the ball's rolling. And so I don't think that you can overestimate at all that initial playing. I don't think that you can overestimate at all what Ness was doing. I was with the Emerald Street Boys, the two of the three remaining Emerald Street Boys, a couple of weeks ago doing a photo shoot. And I was trying to tell them how, if you've ever seen the movie, there's a couple of movies out there, like the Butterfly Effect, I think is one of them. And there's one of them like A Sound of Thunder, I think it's called. But anyway, the premise of the movie is if you go back in time and change just one thing, it can completely change everything that happens afterward. And so I was telling them that Mix-a-Lot, went out of his way, in the foreword goes out of his way to talk about how the Emerald Street Boys were his inspiration. I mean, the way they're all the choreographed dance routines and the professionalism and the spacing and everything like that. I mean, so I was saying to them, you cannot, you probably, don't get the credit you should, and you certainly do not get paid for, what you put in and what eventually came. But there is no way that you can 100% say that if you did not do your things and inspire Mix-a-Lot in that way, that any of that happens. It might have, but you can't say for sure that it would have. And you can't say that if Mix-a-Lot doesn't do what Mix-a-Lot does, then all of the stuff that comes after him doesn't. I'm not just saying that there would have been no hip hop scene otherwise, but I'm just saying that you can't take for granted, or you can't necessarily just assume that if you change one of those little things, that everything continues to happen the same way. And I happen to think that the totality of hip hop, of the story of hip hop in Seattle is, if you're gonna put out, take out New York, LA, and kind of the huge markets, I think the story of hip hop here matches up just in terms of its inspiration and its determination and the creativity that came here. I think it matches up in just about any other city you're gonna find outside of those big major metropolitan top.
I would argue in some ways it surpasses it. We just don't, and this is mentioned in the book too, we just haven't gotten that notoriety that, in many ways we deserve, because, I maybe I'm biased, but
well, I think that
it's pretty incredible. There's a lot of talent. There's a lot of shitty rappers too. There's a lot of trash out there, but when you weed through that, there are some true gems, and there have always been some really incredible artists.
Right. And I think that another thing that's talked about in the book very briefly is kind of the fact that we're kind of isolated in this part of the country, and for quite a while, people have kind of commented that that isolation has given people kind of license from here to not feel like they have to copy what other people are doing. And so I think that has manifested itself in so many ways, in so many different aspects of the culture, not just emceeing, but all four different aspects of the culture.
Yeah. I'm going to skip one of my questions, but I do want to talk a little bit more about media to an extent, and the fact that independent media has played a pretty huge role in the promotion of local hip hop. And so, you know, you mentioned the Rocket. We had the Rocket as one of the first to regularly highlight the scene. And then the 90s gave us The Flavor, which was a Seattle-based hip hop magazine. And then we had C-Spot magazine and cspot.com that soon followed. And then we also had programs on our local public access channel. So you also mentioned, you know, Music Inner City, the Cool Out Network. So I want to hear a little bit about the idea of, you know, people involved in the scene really taking it into their own hands to create the platforms to elevate local hip hop rather than waiting for the mainstream to do it, because, you know, we weren't being played on, you know, when K-Fox, you know, was no longer, and, you know, we had KRIZ, you know, which is another AM station that would play a little bit of local hip hop, but on the FM stations, we weren't getting any airplay, and, you know, there was the picketing and all that, and you weren't, you know, certainly nothing on television outside of the public access was
Silver
showcasing.
Shadow D organized that
that protest,
outside Q.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, I think that was some of what inspired folks to take things into their own hands. But, you know, what do you think what else really contributed to people just being like, we got to do this on our own?
I think it's exactly what you said. I mean, hip hop has always been the ultimate kind of do-it-yourself culture. It is literally the definition of creating something from nothing. And so I think that spirit really really shines through in these examples that you're talking about. I mean, Gordon Curvey starting Music Inner City, and I believe it was December of 1990, down at the Seattle Access Network. I think it was it Scan?
Scan, yeah.
So he's doing that. And so he's broadcasting that, and Giorgio Brown recently moved from New York City, is watching it one day. And at the end, it says, you too can come down to Scan and take some classes and you can have a show. And so he goes down there, takes the classes, and they hit him up immediately. And they're like, okay, we have, you know, an hour or 2 hour slot, you know, every Tuesday for 30 weeks. Can you do something with this? And so he's like, takes his camera out, and he is like, he really hadn't stopped, you know, since the early 90s, right? Since the early 90s, has just been kind of the go-to documentarian when it comes to local hip hop. But I think another terrific example is Chikundi, DJ Kunlove Salisbury. And so he comes back from college here in the early 90s. And the DJ game was already kind of, you know, he had done some DJing and party stuff when he was over in Elizabeth City. And so he comes back, and he's kind of, even though he was from here, he's kind of starting at the bottom of the pile because people have been building up their names and resumes as far as DJing while he was still in college. So he comes back, and he starts what starts off as a kind of a neighborhood barbecue for his birthday party. Within, like, I think it's in 92 or 93, by like 94, 95, it's turned into the Virgo Party. And that becomes kind of like the premier urban event, or kind of premier kind of hip hop flavored event in the city. And so I'm not exactly remembering which year it was, but it's like 96 or 97. That the Virgo Party was big enough to be held at a downtown venue, and was popular enough to where it was attracting a lot more people than the venue could hold. And so there was a couple hundred people that don't get in, and then there's this like a riot, if you want to call it. I think that's what the newspaper called it, where the people who didn't get in were, you know, going down and breaking into, you know, doing some looting and breaking into stores and stuff like that. And the newspaper the next day is kind of intimating that it was the Virgo Party's fault. You know what I mean? The only reason that all those people were down there was because of the Virgo Party. And that really rubbed Chikundi the wrong way, because he didn't really have a platform to really respond to that.
Right.
I think maybe the Stranger maybe did a kind of a quick interview or something like that with him around it, or something, but it wasn't what he felt was sufficient in terms of getting his response to what he had been accused of. So having been a computer science major in college, he kind of gets out ahead of this whole thing and creates C-Spot. And it's labeled as the gateway to Northwest urban culture. And I have to say that it was really a brilliant kind of turn of what they did here, because one of their chief strategies was, as they get into the 2000s, was to start sending photographers to
Yep.
every single event
Every event.
that was happening and take pictures of as many people as they could. You know what I'm saying? And telling all the people who they took pictures of, yo, you can go to C-Spot and come check yourself out. You want to see this picture? You want to see yourself? Go to C-Spot. So what people had to do was they had to go to the website, and there were pages and pages and pages, just hundreds and thousands of pictures.
Oh, I remember.
That you had to scroll through.
Listen, every time I went to an event, I go to cspot.com the following few days and dig through, find my picture, download it,
And
download
so,
it.
you
I
know,
still have those
each
pictures.
one of those looks was an independent page view.
Yeah.
When you're searching through,
Yeah.
and by the early 2000s, the traffic on the C-Spot website on a daily basis was surpassing that of the Seattle Times.
I'm sure.
And so, I mean, I just think that whole just idea and kind of executing that was just a fantastic just kind of example of how people here, to your point in the question, weren't just going to be waiting around for you know what I'm saying? He wasn't going to wait around for the next time he threw the Virgo party and something maybe didn't go right for the largest newspaper in town to try to throw him under the bus. He was going to do something where he had his own platform that could magnify his own voice. And I think that that's such a classic example of Seattle hip hop.
I mean, brilliant. I'm glad you expanded on that too, because I really feel like what he did with cspot.com was just, it was ahead of the game. It was ahead of the game.
Completely so.
You know, it was a little pre-social media, certainly, you know, not to the extent that social media is today. So that was our social media, you know, going to cspot.com and seeing the reflections of ourselves in those environments. And then also, you know, the recaps, and then, you know, the magazine being that platform for us to relate to each other, for our stories to be told in ways that we understood it, you know, highlighting folks from the neighborhood, you know, that were performers, you know, seeing our friends on the cover of C-Spot magazine. You know, I have those in my collection.
I wrote a weekly column for C-Spot for 2 years, a weekly column called Knowledge Street. And I still can't believe that I came up every week with something to write about. I'm sure probably a lot of them were trash, but I mean, I look back on that now and I was just happy to be part of it. It was like, didn't get paid anything for it, but was just happy to kind of be participating in this kind of larger community media venture. I mean, and you're so right. That really was social media before social media. 100%. Kind of browsing.
Shout out to Kun.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
I mean, and everything you're doing, that you've been doing. I mean, he's been the guy out here in this city for just so long. So shout out to you, Kun. And so we're clearly over time. Hopefully people are still sticking around, because I do want to just kind of wrap this with one more question and then see if there are any questions from the viewers that we can address before we go. So I want to just talk about, you know, kind of end on the note of just hometown pride, Seattle pride. And, you know, I feel like, you know, Seattle hip hop is not really defined. You know, we can't really be put in a box as far as, you know, defining a certain sound for Seattle hip hop. But what I do find is that there's a common thread within Seattle hip hop, and then that's just a pride about being from Seattle for the most part. And I feel like the theme's been repeated, you know, since the very beginning, starting with the Emerald Street Boys, literally naming themselves after the nickname, the Emerald City. And then, you know, if you can just, you know, randomly choose a song by a local hip hop artist, and you'll hear, you know, them talking about the neighborhood that they're from, or a street name, or a landmark, or a Seattle specific event. You know, there's always some reference to Seattle when it comes to Seattle hip hop. And so, you know, what do you think it is about Seattle that really makes people proud to represent what, you know, we call the town?
I think that at its core, rap music has always been about telling who you are and what it's like where you're from. And that kind of discourse really builds community. So I think that's part of it. I also think that another part of it is that isolation here, and kind of feeling like, you know what I'm saying, we're by ourselves up here. And it really shows in, if you think about the people who have won the kind of the ultimate symbol of mainstream rap music, the Rap Grammy. The people who have won the Rap Grammy, who have come from here, have done so by not following the trends that other people are doing. I mean, if Sir Mix-a-Lot is talking about Impossible, he didn't win the Grammy for Posse on Broadway, I know, but I'm just saying that, you know, in the song, he's talking about being up at Dick's and stopping a man from physically assaulting his girlfriend using some mace. That's not exactly what NWA and Ice-T were talking about. In fact, Ice-T in the song 6 in the Morning is talking about beating a woman down in the middle of the street. Okay, so that's an extreme, you know what I'm saying, going the other way and kind of reversing field on what by 87 had already, Gangsta Rap 88 had already become immensely popular. So it would have been easy to kind of go along with that. If you think about Diggable Planets and someone like Ishmael Butler, Garfield High School, class of 87.
Bulldogs in the house, by the way.
You know, he goes to New York and forms Diggable Planets. Diggable Planets release an album where they're kind of talking about themselves as insects, you know what I'm saying? And they're talking about Marx, and they're talking about socialism. And they have a song on there called La Femme Fatale, which is a pro-choice song in which he name checks Roe v. Wade. Not too many mainstream rap artists were doing that in the mid 1990s. And then obviously Macklemore, you know, the two of his biggest songs, Thrift Shop and Same Love, go against two of the most lonely things within hip hop, which Thrift Shop going against bling and Same Love going against homophobia. And so I just think that the notion of coming from here and being able to kind of be true to your authentic artistic self is something that drives this scene. And I think that is something that has driven this scene in the past, and is something that will continue to drive this scene in the future. And like I said, having kind of these, so when I was first listening to Rapper's Delight, I caught that little cue where Big Bank Hank was talking about how he had a color TV so he could see the Knicks play basketball. And that was just a real kind of subtle reference to New York and where he was from. And so even from the very beginning, that's been a very important part. And I think that there's a natural pride, you know, outside of hip hop, kind of a natural pride that people have from being here. But then when you add hip hop and add the fact that representation is such a big thing in hip hop, and you know, in the Baby Got Back video, you know, all the guys are wearing all the different gear of all the sports teams from around here. I think that kind of support and that kind of esteem, that kind of healthy esteem, never mind what the rest of, you know what I'm saying, what the rest of the country might think about. I mean, people were making fun of Seattle hip hop. Billboard magazine in 1986 called Seattle a hip hop hotbed. And there was nothing serious about that. That was completely mocking the town. But it's always been like, never mind what everybody else thinks. You know, we know what we have here, and what we have is authenticity, ideology, and skill. And those are the things that define hip hop.
Boom. There you have it. Be yourself, kids. It's okay. So let's turn it to Stesha and see if there's any questions from the viewers before we close this out.
That's great. Thanks so much, both of you. That was really great conversation. We've got a couple questions coming in. I have one from Mike that says, what is the COVID and post-COVID hip hop story, and what should city government do to support it?
Wow. I think I was saying earlier, maybe not tonight, but I was definitely saying earlier that I'm not happy that this COVID situation has happened and that the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor protests have happened. But what I am interested in and excited about is the art that is going to come from this time. And I think that we're still in the midst. I mean, I think probably some has come, but after there's a little bit of distance and people have time to kind of reflect on it and put pen to paper or dance foot to floor or whatever the expression may be, I'm really excited and interested to see and hear what the art comes. Now, the problem is are there going to be any venues left when it's time to come back? Because if I didn't, I just see that the Crocodile is it moving?
No,
or
they're
is it shutting
moving.
down?
That's actually, I was gonna bring that up. Crocodile, they're moving out of their space. Oops, but they're going into to a different space, and
Okay,
so
good.
that's great. They're not.
Man,
they're-
when I saw that,
but we are losing.
yeah.
venues.
At first I didn't see moving. I thought it was closing, and I looked in the back of the book. Man, the Crocodile is mentioned hella time.
Yeah.
So it is a a crucial venue when we're talking about live performances. But but you know, I see, what do I see? I see like one of those signs up on Numos that
Right.
seems to indicate that there's going to be, you know, a few
This is
story
what can
apartment
happen.
building
Yeah.
with
that's-
some retail on the bottom.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I think, you know, Chop Suey is you know, all of these venues that really breathed a lot of lifeblood into the local scene. And kind of sustained it, really. I mean, you got to have live shows to have any kind of active hip hop scene. So I think those venues and kind of the ability to come back together and celebrate hip hop live in a live format is really going to be one of the crucial kind of getting back on the horse aspects of trying to get things back to normal.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. It's a worrisome thing. I was happy to see that the Crocodile was moving as well.
Yeah.
Not closing. So we've got another question here from Lisa. What current record stores in and around Seattle do you believe best support local hip hop artists and the culture?
Wow.
Not
Are there
many
any?
exist.
I mean,
Easy
are-
Street.
Easy Street still.
Easy Street, I think it is one of the only.
There's I want to say there's one right across the street from the building that houses UW Press, which is on 45th and oh God, I looked at it every time I walked into that building. I'll have to go back and look at it. But I haven't even been. I mean,
Who knows
when's
if
the
they
last time
support
I
him?
went to a record store? I can't even remember the last time I went to a record store.
Yeah.
You?
No.
I mean, I think I saw a commercial for Tower Records. I didn't know they were still around. But that's beside the point. But no, so that's actually a good question because that one that I feel woefully inadequate in answering because, I mean, just those couple of locations outside of that, I mean, I really don't think that record stores really have to be an endangered species at this point.
Yeah, I think our DJ friends would probably know a little bit more about that. They're the ones that, you know, are seeking
Yes.
out albums and,
Right.
and hunting for those things. And I know probably, you know, folks like Top and Supreme
yeah,
would
yeah.
probably know
For sure.
of some locally, but I think for us, you know, listeners, just regular listeners, we're not really looking for music at record stores anymore. We're getting everything.
From like SoundCloud or Spotify or on YouTube.
We're streaming.
Yeah. So I guess I would just say, you know, there's probably a lot of local artists that have their stuff up on SoundCloud. And so that probably is a great way to support them. If you can't get to a record store, you can certainly purchase their stuff online. So
Yeah.
in lieu of a record store, I would definitely encourage doing that.
That's great. Yeah. And I live in West Seattle and we do have Easy Street here still, which is great. And then Sonic Boom, I think, is one that's still in Ballard.
yeah.
I think it's still open, but yeah, endangered species for sure. Here's another one from an anonymous person saying, the rappers I've known from Seattle are extremely versatile and so on point with their creativity and lyrics. Even if biased, do you think Seattle has other most underrated artists in the country? Or maybe, do we have the most underrated, I think is maybe what we're asking here. And then which current artist from Seattle do you think should blow up? So.
One comes to mind, a young man named Rel B. Free, and I am biased because he's a Zion kid. You know what I'm saying? His sister was a Zion kid, and you know I taught at Zion in the '90s, but I'm a little bit biased. But I love what he is doing in terms of mixing his art with his activism, and there's usually not too much room in between the two, and the way that I just love their whole family. I just love the whole Davis family.
Right,
I mean,
right.
And so I love what their parents have done in raising those two wonderful children. But Rel, I mean, he's somebody who is just relentless in his pursuit of not only hip hop, but also equity and social justice. So that's someone whose name I would throw out there.
And I just, we recently featured Rail in a Langston program in October when we partnered with the Kennedy Center. And so look back for that. If you're not familiar with Rail Be Free, he did a spoken word piece. And you can also find him on YouTube. I mean, that's a great one. Rail Be Free, amazing young man, just a great person, amazing spoken word artist, amazing rapper, amazing community member.
I would throw Gifted Gab in there as well.
Gabby,
there's a particular song with her and her partner Blimes Brixton called Come Correct that they filmed in front of the Red Apple. Not only do I love that song, but I love shooting it at that location and the significance of it.
Demolition.
Right before its demolition. You can see there's no cars parked there. You can see there's nobody in the store. So I love the sentimentality of that video. So those are just a couple examples.
Yeah.
That's great. And we put the links to their sites in the chat. So if there's somebody that you don't know, you can check them out right now. So it looks like that may be all of the questions that we've got coming in at this point. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to chat about before we thank everybody? And
in the introduction, there's a little line in the introduction that was based on a picture on the television that an old college roommate sent to me, and it was on cable they have music channels that you can listen to music, and they have factoids of an artist when they're up there, and there was a Macklemore song playing, and there was a Did You Know, and it said, did you know Macklemore grew up in the spoken word community because of Seattle's barely there hip hop scene, and I think that speaks to even today. I mean, this was just not even that long ago that this thing is up there, and so I just think that speaks to I kind of enjoy the underdog. I kind of enjoy people underestimating this area. I kind of think, fine, go ahead and continue to do that. In the meantime, we have continually put out this high quality level of varying hip hop music. I mean, it's so funny because before grunge was known as grunge, it was known as the Seattle sound.
Yeah.
Which is in sharp contrast to the fact that in a lot of ways, in a lot of people's opinions, there's no really singular way to categorize Seattle hip hop. And I think that's such a blessing. It's such a treasure. It's the variety. There's something for everybody. And the fact that so many people from so many different eras and now generations have contributed so much to this scene. I mean, it's just as much as I love hip hop and as much as I love this city, my heart is full just at the level of achievement and creativity and just trying to be different that has come from this place. I love it.
Dope. I just would like to say that I'm really happy that we can celebrate Hip Hop History Month this year together. Celebrating the release of your book, celebrating Seattle hip hop, and us being kind of champions for the scene, being bulldogs, kind of just the whole thing. It's really great to be here with you today. And Langston was really happy to be able to put together a week's worth of programming celebrating hip hop history. We just did a full rebroadcast of our 206 The Break series, which Dowdy also played a part in. So hopefully some folks caught that as well. Another inside joke.
It's the same guy. I shaved.
If you caught his episode, he looked completely different. It was early quarantine time. But we continue these partnerships with Wanawari and the Seattle Public Library, Elliott Bay, so forth. Stesha will acknowledge everybody in a minute, but we are really happy to continue to be able to do this work, especially at this time. And so I just wanted to put that out there, that we're still out here doing the work and we're doing the best we can to give everybody great content. And so thank you for supporting us, especially this year, considering everything that we've been through.
Oh, well, thank you so much to both of you. And, that's just a great conversation tonight. And for folks that are interested in getting copies of Emerald Street, you can find it at the library. Yes. Oh, thank you very much for that display. You can find it at the library's website, spl.org. You can also get copies from our partners at Elliott Bay Book Company, who, as I mentioned earlier, are open for limited browsing or curbside pickup. And of course, you can always order copies of Emerald Street through Elliott Bay's website as well, and that's elliottbaybook.com. Thank you so much to Dowdy and to Jasmine for tonight's wonderful conversation. Thank you to our event partners, Langston, Wanawari, Elliott Bay Book Company, and University of Washington Press. Special thank you to Michael B. Main for the event production tonight and being a great host. We're also grateful to our sponsors, the Seattle Public Library Foundation, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, Seattle City of Literature, and the Seattle Times. And as we close tonight, we're going to leave you with a video for Home from Jake One. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Oh, hell no. Oh, my God.
From 206. You know this, the place to be if you blow pip. Medical car, see the doctor on some Kumo shit. Split the blunt after you fold it, you gon' trip. But happy on some pimp shit. New clothes kicks. Little mommy stroking the mink like you so crisp. If you notice, these fools know tricks to scoop your bitch, so keep your game tight. Don't lose your grip like Jeremy Stevens. It's not the place to be if you're barely eating. Wintertime is the therapy season. They say the overcast, depressions and stunts grow, but them ain't rain clouds, my nigga, that's blunt smoke. Take them back to the scene, yo. Show them what I mean, no. Sharp ball, art ball, Oscars, Dino. Streets, fish grease, same D. Better weed, though. Dark days, vice nights, Vasquez, King Cole. News travels word of mouth. I know you heard about dude who turned state. He been talking to Curly Cows about J-U-O-S-L-P. M-O-A, Valley Hood, issue, Bruce, South Side, West Side, dilapidated, gentrified. 40 ounce for breakfast, macchiato when I'm high. Promised to make her mine. She let me get it, rain, sleet, or shine. Yeah, that's Seattle state of mind. Damn, it feels good to talk about home. What's your word? What's your word? Damn, it feels good to talk about home. Rise and shine, bitches. Check how Seattle do. The flow sick shit. Call it Seattle flu. Out of town acting wild, my Seattle crew. Run this Jake track just like Seattle slew. And the green that we blow from Seattle too. That was grown in a lab at Seattle U. At Westfield, 12th man, my Seattle dude. Nate Burleson wearing that Seattle blue. Bosworth made all of Seattle blue. The Sonics let Kim go. Seattle's through. I read Seattle Times, I watch Seattle News. I hope Seattle win, I watch Seattle lose.
Man, it's about that time to pop that cork and pour out that shine. Ooh. Pull out hard grind, getting better like wine, make the dimes then wine. Yeah, that's me, white and free, banging J Soup LP in the hood, like the young niggas bang LP. Union Jackson, yes, slur 2-3. Boy, I stay ooh-wee. You do you and let me do me, and I I bet I'll crack these half-ass niggas ain't wet on the track. What up, Marlon? These pussy niggas not ballers. You fucking with the town rap scholars. Bitch, holler, holler. We just very low-key. Don't think that a nigga don't very blow heat. And ain't nary nothing sweet. Solo though is my idol, man. Cherry is the street. The streets bury my peeps. Credit Dre, Dow, Dude, being Baby T. I bought Cools and Mr. Lowe's for my moms in the doghouse hallways. It made my flows bomb. From the CD to we is all just alike. Panthers and gangsters raised us up right. When the chips crash, stand your ass up and fight. Some told the chop blow, me I gun Mike. Hey, check it, and I will gun you down. See Dylan killing how we run through sound. Up the middle, boy, the whole world renowned. First we built it, then we killed it, then we tilted that crown. To the left, cause I'm fresh off the right, cause we tight to the back. What's the half shit? Nothing. Headed up the grannies with these L's and the facts. Some say I pushed it forward, some say he brought it back. I put the ill up and real, you a fake when I'm chill when the bill with the J1.
Damn, it feels good to talk about home.
When I'm done, you'll look me upside the back.
Damn, it feels good to talk about home. Damn, it feels good to talk about home. What's really going on? Damn, it feels good to talk about home.
Peace out, homie.
Think this about a bitch.